In the small, isolated town of Bellerose, Maine, Sister Evelyn was known for her calm, compassionate nature. At 28, she had become an integral part of the local convent, a sanctuary for women seeking solace and purpose. The convent, nestled among towering pines and quiet streets, was a place of peace, of faith, and for some, a sense of belonging. But that peace was shattered one autumn afternoon in 2017, when a family portrait session meant to capture a rare moment of joy became the backdrop to a mystery that would haunt the town for years to come. The photograph was intended to commemorate a special event, an anniversary, a gathering, a fleeting glimpse of togetherness, but it would soon take on a far darker significance. Evelyn stood alongside the other nuns in the portrait, her gentle smile a momentary glimpse of happiness. But as the photo was developed, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Sister Evelyn was missing from the final image, not lost in the frame or obscured by shadows, but entirely absent. There were no explanations, no answers to why she wasn't there. Her place, once filled with warmth and grace, now stood eerily empty. At first, the community tried to dismiss the oddity, but when Evelyn didn't return after the photo was taken, concern turned to panic. Her belongings were still in her room, untouched. The door was locked, but there was no sign of struggle. Her bed was neatly made the way she liked it. No one knew where she had gone or why she'd left. Had she simply walked away, or was something far darker at play? The investigation into Evelyn's disappearance began almost immediately, but it quickly became apparent that there were no leads to follow. The small town of Bellerose, once known for its safety and close-knit nature, was thrust into a wave of fear and confusion. There were no signs of forced entry at the convent, no CCTV footage, no witnesses. The only thing that remained as a trace of her was that haunting family portrait, a clue, a symbol, but ultimately a riddle that wouldn't be solved. For days, the town's police combed through the woods surrounding the convent, checking abandoned buildings, even asking nearby neighbors if they had seen anything unusual. Helicopters flew over the forest, and search dogs were brought in to track any trace of Evelyn, but there was nothing. No scent, no footprints. As the hours turned to days, then weeks, the search stretched into months, each passing day bringing with it the haunting realization that the young nun had vanished without a trace. The case was covered widely by the media, local news stations running continuous updates, but each time, the story seemed to lose its grip on the public's attention. Sister Evelyn had simply disappeared, and with no new leads, the investigation stagnated. For a while, it seemed like no one could bear to speak her name. Her disappearance felt like a ghost haunting the town, a question with no answer, a person who had never been fully seen to begin with. Those close to her, the other nuns, the convent staff, and even her family, were left to wonder. Did she leave voluntarily? Had she been planning to escape, to leave the convent behind, perhaps seeking a life outside the church? Or had something sinister happened to her? Perhaps someone had taken her. But if so, why? No ransom note, no threats. The questions piled up one after another, with no answers, no closure. Her family struggled to reconcile the image of their loved one, so full of kindness, with the idea that she might have willingly left. It didn't feel right, but the questions remained unanswered, like the empty space where Sister Evelyn should have stood in that photograph. The town of Bellerose, once home to a strong sense of community and faith, was now bound by a shared sorrow, a grief that had no outlet. And yet, as the months passed, the mystery of Sister Evelyn's disappearance began to fade from the minds of many, overshadowed by the passing of time. But for those who had known her, the void was impossible to fill. What had happened to Evelyn? Was she lost forever, or was there more to this story than anyone was willing to believe? The family portrait, left behind in the convent, was all that remained. A quiet testament to the woman who had vanished, a symbol of the grief that had taken root in Bellerose. And with it came a lingering question. Would anyone ever learn the truth about what had happened to Sister Evelyn, or would she remain a ghost in the frame forever? It would be years before the town would find answers, but by then, the mystery would have only deepened, and that photograph, that single haunting image, would lead them all closer to the chilling truth. Detective Jane Miller had been with the Bellerose Police Department for nearly a decade, but nothing had prepared her for the chilling case of Sister Evelyn. Assigned to investigate the disappearance of the 28-year-old nun, Jane arrived at the convent, a place of peace and quiet, now cloaked in suspicion. The town had once considered the convent a pillar of faith, a sanctuary for the lost, but Evelyn's vanishing had cast a long shadow over everything. It was as though the calmness of the convent itself had been disrupted by an invisible force. Jane's first step was to interview the other nuns, but the accounts she received were conflicting, making the case more frustrating by the day. Some spoke highly of Evelyn, describing her as a dedicated, compassionate individual who had always been a steady presence within the convent. But others painted a different picture. They spoke of her growing isolation, how she had become increasingly withdrawn in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. She had stopped joining the others for meals and prayers, spending more time alone in her room, her once vibrant spirit dimming. There were whispers, too, of something more unsettling, of Evelyn mentioning a calling in the days before her vanishing. A mysterious pull, as if something was beckoning her, something outside the convent's walls. Jane pressed further, trying to make sense of the contradictions. Had Evelyn become disillusioned with the life she had chosen? Had she heard some inner voice telling her to leave, or had something more sinister happened? The answers remained elusive, wrapped in layers of silence and vague allusions to things unspoken. One of the older nuns, Sister Agnes, seemed especially troubled when Jane asked about the calling Evelyn had mentioned. Agnes hesitated, her eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and resignation. "We are all called in different ways," she said cryptically, offering no further explanation. But Jane couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Evelyn's disappearance than the nuns were willing to admit. As the investigation continued, Jane's doubts only deepened. Despite the growing list of strange occurrences surrounding the convent, there was still no hard evidence to support any of the theories. Jane discovered that in the weeks leading up to Evelyn's disappearance, she had left behind a series of cryptic notes written in a hurried, almost frantic manner. The notes were fragmented, pieces of a puzzle that seemed to speak of things only Evelyn understood. One note, found tucked beneath her pillow, read, "I can't keep pretending. It's all coming to a head." Another, written on the back of a prayer card, simply said, "I'm not safe." The messages were vague, unsettling, but they pointed to something much deeper, a fear that had been growing inside Evelyn, something that had driven her to the edge. Then there were the rumors. Whispers among the older nuns about a hidden chapel somewhere in the convent, a place that wasn't spoken of in the open. No one seemed to know where it was or what it contained, but every so often someone would mention it in hushed tones, as if the very idea of it was forbidden. Jane was drawn to these rumors, sensing that the key to Evelyn's disappearance might lie in the secrets buried within the convent itself. But when she tried to investigate further, she was met with resistance. The nuns, polite and composed on the surface, seemed uncomfortable with her questions. Their eyes darted nervously when Jane pressed them about the hidden chapel, and their responses became evasive, as if they were guarding something they weren't ready to share. Despite all the troubling signs, there was still no concrete evidence that pointed to a crime. No signs of foul play, no obvious suspects. The possibility that Evelyn had simply left, perhaps in search of something beyond the convent, lingered in the back of Jane's mind. She considered the theory carefully, wondering if Evelyn had indeed made a voluntary decision to leave. But something about the case didn't sit right. The cryptic notes, the hidden chapel, the whispers of a mysterious calling. It all felt like more than just a young woman seeking a change of scenery. There was a darker undercurrent to the whole situation, one that Jane couldn't quite put her finger on. As Jane stood in the quiet halls of the convent, staring at the photograph of Sister Evelyn that had been taken just before her disappearance, she felt a growing sense of unease. The empty space where Evelyn should have been, the absence that haunted the image, it was a reminder of the questions still left unanswered. Had Evelyn really left on her own, or had someone, forced her into the shadows? The deeper Jane delved into the investigation, the more the line between possibility and suspicion began to blur. The truth, it seemed, was not so easily uncovered, but Jane couldn't let go. She knew that something was hidden in the darkness of the convent's walls, something that would eventually surface, if only she could find it. 3 years had passed since Sister Evelyn's disappearance, but the mystery surrounding her had never truly faded from the minds of those who had known her. In the quiet town of Bellerose, whispers still lingered, rumors whispered in hushed tones, and a haunting emptiness had settled over the convent where Evelyn had once lived. The case, once the center of attention, had gradually faded from the media's eye, yet for Detective Jane Miller, the questions remained unanswered. And then, one day, everything changed. It started with a phone call. Jane was working late when the voice on the other end of the line revealed something unexpected. A family member of the nuns, someone who had once been close to Evelyn, claimed to have found something that might shed new light on the case. It wasn't much, just an old photograph. But to Jane, it was a lead. The photograph in question was the family portrait that had been taken just before Evelyn disappeared, the one where her absence had been so stark and eerie. For 3 years, that portrait had remained a symbol of the unknown, a reminder of the young woman who had vanished without a trace. But now, there was something new, something that would change everything. The family member had kept the portrait hidden away for years, not knowing what to do with it. When Jane arrived to examine it, she immediately noticed something chilling. In each version of the photo, whether it had been passed around to different family members or handed down through the years, Sister Evelyn was always present, but she was never facing the camera. Every single copy of the portrait showed Evelyn with her face turned away, her body in the exact same position as in the original photograph, but her head always tilted in a way that kept her eyes from being seen. The most unsettling part of the image was the sadness that seemed to radiate from her, an overwhelming sense of sorrow that made the eyes she couldn't show all the more haunting. Her expression, though never fully visible, exuded something dark, as though she was trapped in the very photograph itself, a victim of some unseen force. Jane studied the photograph closely, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck prickle with unease. This wasn't just a strange coincidence. It was a pattern, a detail that couldn't be ignored. Every copy, without exception, had the same feature: Evelyn's face averted, her eyes lost in the shadows of the frame. There was something undeniably unsettling about the whole thing, as if the portrait itself was trying to communicate something, a message that had been hidden for years. It was clear that Evelyn wasn't just absent from the picture in the way she had been absent from the town and the convent. She was physically present, but emotionally, no, spiritually, absent. The portrait's unsettling nature led Jane to revisit the idea that Evelyn's disappearance was no mere act of walking away. She had always considered the possibility that Evelyn had left voluntarily, but this photograph suggested something else. Could it be that she had been kept from the photograph on purpose, that her absence was part of something darker? Had someone been controlling her even after her disappearance? The photograph was, in a way, a frozen moment, a record of Evelyn's isolation that stretched beyond her absence from the convent. It felt as though she were still bound to the place in some inexplicable way, trapped within the frame itself. It didn't take long for Jane to receive another piece of the puzzle. A few days after the family portrait resurfaced, Jane was contacted by a family member who claimed to have seen the original version of the photo before it had been altered. According to this relative, the original photograph didn't show Evelyn looking away. In the original shot, Evelyn was smiling, her face fully visible, her eyes directed toward the camera, as if nothing was amiss. This new information seemed to shift the investigation in a new direction. The photo had been tampered with, deliberately, perhaps. But by whom? And why? Why would someone want to change the portrait? What was it about Evelyn's gaze that was so important? The discovery of the altered photograph deepened the mystery. Detective Miller began to wonder, could the portrait be the key to understanding Evelyn's fate? Was there something symbolic about the way she was depicted in these versions of the photo, something that might hold a clue to what had happened to her? The more Jane examined the details, the more questions surfaced. The photograph seemed to suggest a deliberate attempt to control how Evelyn was remembered, how she was seen. It was as if someone had not only erased her from the picture, but had sought to hide her away, to lock her in a place where her face could never again be fully seen. And why would anyone do that unless they were trying to conceal the truth? As Jane stood over the photo, studying Evelyn's averted gaze, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this image than anyone had realized. The photograph was no longer just a memento. It had become a symbol of the secrets that had been kept, a testament to the power of those who wanted to keep the truth buried. The more Jane thought about it, the more certain she became. Evelyn's disappearance was not a random event. It was part of something much larger, something far darker. And the photograph, those subtle, haunting details, might be the key to unlocking the mystery. The questions piled up and the stakes grew higher. What had really happened to Sister Evelyn, and why, after all this time, had this photograph resurfaced, carrying with it the unsettling answer that no one had been able to see? Detective Jane Miller had seen her fair share of strange cases, but nothing quite like this. The family portrait of Sister Evelyn had raised more questions than answers, and despite her best efforts, the investigation had only become murkier with each passing day. The altered photographs, where Evelyn's face was perpetually averted from the camera, seemed to hint at something far more sinister than a simple disappearance. But it wasn't until Jane called in the forensic team to analyze the photo that the case truly took a dark turn. The analysis began like any other, standard digital forensics. The team was prepared to look for any signs of digital manipulation, from software editing to pixel-based anomalies. What they found, however, was something far more disturbing. The alterations to the family portrait weren't the result of the usual photo editing tricks. The digital manipulation they had anticipated was absent. Instead, the real anomaly lay in the way Sister Evelyn's eyes flickered in every version of the photo. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable to the untrained eye, but when magnified, it was impossible to ignore. Evelyn's pupils, in every copy of the image, seemed to shift in an unnatural, almost imperceptible way, as if they were alive, flickering, moving, and never settling. It was as if her eyes weren't just an image frozen in time, but rather a living, breathing part of the photograph itself. The forensic team had never encountered anything like it before. The image didn't appear to have been digitally altered in the way they had expected, yet the eyes carried a sense of something eerie, something almost supernatural. It was as though the eyes of the woman in the portrait weren't merely captured by the camera, but somehow distorted, trapped in an eternal state of longing, confusion, and fear. The flickering seemed to be linked to a specific moment in time, just before Evelyn had disappeared. The timing of these anomalies in the photographs pointed directly to the days following her vanishing, as if someone had tampered with the photo after she had gone missing. The idea that this could be a simple glitch or digital error was quickly ruled out. No, this was something far more deliberate, something designed to manipulate the way Evelyn was remembered. The revelation of the altered photographs raised even more troubling questions. If these images had been manipulated after her disappearance, who had access to the photos? How could someone have altered them without leaving behind any trace of the manipulation? More unsettling still, why would anyone go to such lengths to distort Evelyn's image in this specific way? What message were they trying to send, or perhaps hide? Jane couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about Evelyn. It was about controlling how others saw her, controlling the narrative of her life and her disappearance. But the question of who had done this, and why, remained unanswered. With the unsettling evidence in hand, Jane turned her focus to the convent itself. There was a sense of urgency now, a need to understand the dynamics within the walls of the religious order. Who had the power to access the photos, and who stood to benefit from this kind of manipulation? The more she thought about it, the more one name kept resurfacing: Sister Agnes, the same older nun who had spoken so cryptically about Evelyn's calling and seemed to hold some knowledge of the convent's hidden rituals. Jane had a gut feeling that Agnes knew more than she had let on, and she wasn't the only one. Several of the other nuns, though respectful in their demeanor, seemed strangely tight-lipped about the more intimate details of Evelyn's life. But it wasn't just the nuns who caught Jane's attention. It was the convent's computer systems. It turned out that Evelyn had been responsible for overseeing much of the convent's digital records, including the photos that had been taken of the community. Jane had no idea how much access the nuns had to these systems, but it was clear that the photographs, as well as other documents, could be easily altered by those in charge. So she requested a full analysis of the convent's shared computer systems, hoping to uncover more clues about who might have had access to the family portraits. What she uncovered sent a chill through her spine. The digital forensics revealed something disturbing: frequent, unauthorized access to the convent's photo archives in the days leading up to Evelyn's disappearance. The logins were traced back to multiple members of the order, including those closest to Evelyn, but the most concerning part was the timestamps. These logins had occurred late at night, when the convent staff was supposed to be asleep, and were often accompanied by strange files being opened or edited, including the family portrait. Whoever was behind this had been meticulously altering not only the images, but also the records, leaving no paper trail, no evidence, only manipulated memories, carefully crafted to erase or distort the truth. But what was the endgame? Why go to such lengths to alter a photograph? The more Jane thought about it, the more she realized that the manipulation of the photo wasn't just about Evelyn's disappearance. It was about controlling the narrative of her life, her fate, and perhaps even the fate of others who might follow. Someone in the convent had been playing a dangerous game, one that reached far beyond a missing persons case. There were secrets in those altered images, secrets in the darkened corners of the convent, waiting to be uncovered. As Jane stared at the images once more, the flickering eyes of Sister Evelyn haunted her. She was no longer just a missing person. She was a symbol of something far darker, something hidden within the walls of the convent. The question was no longer whether Evelyn had left voluntarily or been taken. It was whether the truth of her disappearance had been manipulated, buried, and erased by those who knew the most about it, and why. Jane knew she had to dig deeper. The photograph was no longer just a clue. It was a key to unlocking the terrifying secrets of the convent, and she was determined to find out who had the power to alter memories, and why. Detective Jane Miller felt as though the walls of the convent were closing in on her. Each passing day, each interview with the nuns, only seemed to deepen the mystery of Sister Evelyn's disappearance. While the townspeople in Bellerose had long since moved on, the case had taken hold of Jane's mind. The more she learned, the more she uncovered a disturbing undercurrent that suggested Evelyn's vanishing was far more complicated than anyone had initially believed. One by one, Jane spoke to the women who had shared their lives with Evelyn at the convent. The stories they told were far from uniform. Some sisters spoke of Evelyn with fondness, painting a picture of a young woman who had quietly and dutifully carried out her responsibilities. But as Jane pressed further, the cracks in their narratives began to show. There were subtle inconsistencies, hints of discomfort, as if these women were holding back something they feared revealing. A particularly cryptic conversation with Sister Agnes, the eldest nun in the convent, raised Jane's suspicions. When Jane asked about Evelyn's state of mind in the days leading up to her disappearance, Agnes hesitated. Her gaze drifted to the floor, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. Then, after a long silence, she spoke in hushed tones. There was someone, a man. He visited Evelyn a few days before she left. He had an unusual influence over her, something I couldn't quite understand. The mention of a man sent a shiver down Jane's spine. No one had ever spoken of a man in connection with Evelyn's disappearance. Evelyn, a dedicated nun, had taken vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. The idea that a man had come into her life and potentially had some kind of power over her seemed impossible, yet it felt like a key piece to the puzzle. But Sister Agnes was reluctant to elaborate further, and when Jane tried to press her, she clammed up, retreating behind a wall of silence. As Jane continued her investigation, more nuns began to speak of this mysterious figure. Some hinted that he wasn't just any man. He was someone with a strange charisma, someone who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to influence others. He had been seen talking to Evelyn on several occasions, though no one could recall what they had discussed. One younger nun, Sister Clara, mentioned that Evelyn had started to speak of visions in the days before she disappeared. These weren't the ordinary visions of prayer or spiritual enlightenment, but something darker, more disconcerting. Evelyn spoke of seeing things that weren't there, of hearing voices in the silence of the night, and of a presence that seemed to guide her every thought. The nuns' accounts were filled with half-formed ideas, whispers of rituals and awakenings, but they were cautious about elaborating too much. It was as if the very mention of these things carried weight, as if they feared acknowledging something they didn't fully understand. A hidden tension simmered just beneath the surface of their calm facades, and Jane could sense it in every word, in every evasive gesture. She realized that the convent held secrets, deep, unsettling secrets, that the sisters were unwilling to share. The more Jane heard, the more she began to piece together a troubling theory. It seemed as though Evelyn's disappearance wasn't simply the result of a troubled mind or a personal crisis. There was a possibility, one Jane couldn't shake, that Evelyn had been manipulated, spiritually and psychologically, by someone with an agenda. The idea of spiritual manipulation, perhaps even mind control, began to take root in Jane's mind. What if this enigmatic figure had used Evelyn's deep faith against her, coercing her into some dark, unknown purpose? What if the visions she had experienced were not merely religious epiphanies, but something far more sinister, a kind of spiritual indoctrination that had pushed her to the edge? Further digging revealed more alarming information. A few of the nuns spoke in hushed tones about a hidden room beneath the convent, a space so secretive that it was kept locked at all times. The door, they said, was never to be opened by anyone except the abbess. The room was rumored to hold sacred relics, sacred writings, things that no outsider should ever see. But as Jane pressed, she learned that Evelyn had been seen there just before she disappeared. No one knew exactly what had transpired in that room, but the idea that it might hold the key to her disappearance was undeniable. Evelyn had been drawn to this hidden place, and now it seemed the convent had done everything in its power to keep that secret buried. Jane knew she had to investigate the hidden room, but every time she tried to approach the nuns about it, they became more evasive. There was a palpable fear in their voices, as if acknowledging the room's existence would somehow unleash something terrible. The closer Jane got to the truth, the more resistance she encountered. It was as though the very walls of the convent were protecting a secret too dangerous to be revealed. As the days passed, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Had Evelyn willingly gone into this room? Had she been coerced? And what had this mysterious figure really wanted from her? Was it power, control, or something more? The unsettling feeling that this was not just a disappearance, but part of something much darker lingered in the air, and Jane couldn't shake the sense that the convent's hidden practices were more than just rumors. They were the key to understanding what had happened to Sister Evelyn. But without hard evidence, all she could do was wait for the moment when the walls would crack and the truth would finally spill out. The question was, would that moment come before it was too late? For the surviving family of Sister Evelyn, grief had become an overwhelming force. Her mother, Miriam, and younger sister, Lily, were left to navigate a reality where their daughter and sister had simply vanished without a trace. To the outside world, the case had gone cold long ago, but for them, the pain was as raw as it had ever been. Every day felt like an eternity spent in a fog of unanswered questions. Miriam held on to the hope that Evelyn had left the convent willingly, that she had simply chosen another path. But as the years wore on, that hope began to feel like a fragile thread, slowly unraveling. Lily, on the other hand, had never fully believed that Evelyn had run away. There were too many unanswered questions, too many oddities in the stories the nuns had told. Something about the way Evelyn had disappeared didn't sit right with her. She began to entertain the idea that something darker had happened, something beyond her sister's control. But without any hard evidence, the family was trapped in a cycle of conflicting beliefs. Miriam, in particular, had clung to the idea that Evelyn had left for some unknown reason, maybe in search of spiritual fulfillment, perhaps even a calling that could only be answered outside the confines of the convent. For her, the thought of something more sinister was unbearable. It was easier to believe that her daughter had chosen a different path than to accept the possibility that something terrible had happened. One day, Miriam received an unexpected visit from a woman she had never met before. She was the mother of Sister Clara, one of the nuns who had lived at the convent with Evelyn. Clara had left the order several months after Evelyn's disappearance, quietly slipping away without any explanation. Miriam had heard rumors about Clara's departure, but never had the chance to speak to her family. This woman, Clara's mother, had come to offer her condolences, but her visit would soon take a darker turn. After a brief conversation about Evelyn's disappearance, Clara's mother hesitated, as if she were weighing whether to share something she had kept to herself. When she spoke, her voice trembled with a mix of fear and urgency. "I overheard a conversation a few weeks before Clara left the convent. It was about Evelyn," she said, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. Clara wasn't supposed to hear it, but she did. They were talking about Evelyn being part of something greater than herself, something that went beyond her vows to the church. They were speaking in hushed tones, but it was clear they were referring to something secret. Miriam's heart stopped. The words felt like a punch to the stomach. "Greater than herself? What do you mean?" she asked, struggling to understand what this woman was saying. Clara's mother continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure exactly what they meant, but it was clear they were talking about Evelyn being involved in something she couldn't escape. It wasn't just about faith or the convent, it was something more, something hidden." The words lingered in the room like a heavy fog. Miriam felt the weight of them, the suggestion that her daughter might have been entangled in something far darker than she had ever imagined. The idea that Evelyn's disappearance could have been planned, that she might have been manipulated into a role she hadn't fully understood, was almost too much to bear. Could Evelyn have been coerced into something? Drawn into a trap she couldn't escape? Could her disappearance have been orchestrated rather than a sudden voluntary decision? Lily, overhearing the conversation from the next room, rushed to her mother's side, her face pale. "What did you hear?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Miriam repeated what Clara's mother had told her, and as the words sank in, the family's world seemed to tilt. The hope that Evelyn had run away willingly began to crumble, replaced by the unsettling possibility that her daughter's disappearance wasn't her choice at all. Miriam's grief deepened, no longer just the mourning of a lost daughter, but the fear that Evelyn had been a victim of something far more sinister, something that had manipulated her in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Lily, however, felt a surge of certainty. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. She had always suspected that something had been hidden from them. The church, the convent. It was clear to her now that there were secrets buried deep within that place, secrets that might have entangled Evelyn in a web she couldn't escape. Her sister hadn't disappeared into thin air. She had been drawn into something, manipulated into a role she didn't fully understand. It wasn't just a matter of leaving, it was a matter of being taken. As Miriam struggled to reconcile this new reality, Lily became more determined than ever to uncover the truth. She could no longer accept the possibility that her sister had willingly walked away from her life, her family, her faith. Something had happened, something hidden beneath layers of secrecy and manipulation. And the more they dug into Evelyn's life at the convent, the more it seemed as though the walls were closing in on them. The family found itself at an emotional crossroads. Miriam, clinging to her belief that Evelyn had made a choice to leave, found herself increasingly at odds with Lily, who felt certain that something far darker had transpired. The division between mother and daughter grew wider as they wrestled with the truth, unsure of which version of Evelyn's story to believe. And yet, deep down, they both knew that the only way to heal their grief, to truly understand what had happened to Evelyn, was to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The more they learned, the more the mystery deepened, and the harder it became to find peace. The burden of not knowing, of not understanding what had really happened to Evelyn, would weigh heavily on them all. And as the secrets of the convent began to unravel, they realized that the journey to uncover the truth would come at a cost they weren't yet prepared to face. Detective Jane Miller had come to a crossroads in the investigation. The case of Sister Evelyn's disappearance had taken on a life of its own, drawing her back to the very place where the mystery had begun, the convent. Despite her growing frustration with the lack of concrete evidence, Jane knew there were still pieces left to uncover. So when she received an anonymous tip about a hidden journal belonging to Evelyn, she couldn't ignore it. The tipster had offered little information, only that the journal was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the convent, hidden among other old unused documents. Jane's instincts told her that this journal might hold the key to understanding Evelyn's state of mind in the days before her disappearance, so she made her way back to the convent once again. Upon arrival, the atmosphere seemed unchanged, the air still thick with the memories of a time before the tragedy. The nuns, though polite and reserved, greeted her with the same wary eyes they had always worn. Jane could feel the tension in the air as she walked through the familiar halls, the weight of the years pressing down on her. This place, once a symbol of peace, now felt like a crypt, its walls filled with unspoken secrets waiting to be uncovered. In the convent's library, Jane sifted through piles of forgotten papers, old letters, and dusty books. It wasn't long before she found it, a small, leather-bound journal tucked beneath a pile of prayer books. It was worn, its pages yellowed with age, but the handwriting inside was unmistakable. Evelyn's. Jane flipped through the pages, her heart pounding as she read Evelyn's cryptic thoughts. The journal was filled with disjointed entries, some detailing mundane aspects of convent life, while others were filled with disturbing reflections. Evelyn wrote about her growing unease with the leadership of the convent, her faith beginning to waver. "I don't know who to trust anymore," one entry read. "I feel like I'm losing myself. The calling doesn't feel right. It feels like a command, not a choice." There were also mentions of disturbing dreams, visions of shadows that seemed to follow her, figures lurking just out of sight. But despite the emotional weight of the entries, there was no direct mention of her disappearance, no clue as to why or how she had vanished. Jane felt a deep unease as she read. Evelyn's state of mind was clearly deteriorating, but there was still no concrete evidence of foul play or any indication that Evelyn had been in immediate danger. The journal left behind more questions than answers, and Jane found herself wondering if Evelyn had been simply unraveling under the pressures of convent life, or if something more insidious was at play. As Jane continued to dig through the old records in the convent's archives, she found a series of unsettling patterns. The more she researched, the more she uncovered disturbing cases from the past, other young women who had disappeared under similarly bizarre circumstances, some of them decades before Evelyn. The records were sparse, but in each case, there was a common thread. All of the women had been part of the convent, and each disappearance occurred after they had shown signs of distress or isolation. The disappearances were always followed by vague explanations, often attributed to the women leaving voluntarily or simply disappearing without a trace. But as Jane studied the details more closely, the coincidences became too pronounced to ignore. Every one of these women had been involved with the same enigmatic figure, a man whose presence loomed over the convent like a shadow. The records were vague on the figure's identity, but Jane quickly pieced together that this person was someone who had access to the convent, someone who had a particular influence over the women who had disappeared. They spoke of his presence in hushed whispers, but there were no names, no concrete descriptions. Just fragments, like pieces of a puzzle that had been intentionally scattered. As Jane's mind raced, a chilling thought crossed her mind. Could Evelyn have been another victim of this same phenomenon? Was there some sort of pattern to these disappearances, one that had been hidden for years, protected by those within the convent? The more Jane thought about it, the more the idea of a deeper conspiracy took root. Could it be possible that the convent wasn't just a place of faith and refuge, but a place where women were systematically manipulated, controlled, and erased? What if these disappearances were not isolated incidents, but part of a much larger, more disturbing agenda? Evelyn's disappearance, it seemed, was just the latest in a long line of vanishing acts, each one leaving behind a trail of confusion and grief. Jane knew she had to dig deeper, but the walls of the convent felt like they were closing in on her. The truth, it seemed, was buried beneath layers of secrecy and denial. She had uncovered enough to know that something far darker than a simple missing persons case was at play. But without hard evidence, she was trapped, unable to prove the conspiracy that was slowly revealing itself before her eyes. As she stood in the silent library, surrounded by the dusty records of those who had come before, Jane's determination grew. She wasn't going to let Evelyn's case go cold, not when there were so many unanswered questions. The puzzle pieces were aligning, but she needed more than whispers, more than fragments. She needed the truth, and she was willing to risk everything to uncover it. The walls of the convent might be holding its secrets, but Jane Miller wasn't leaving until she had broken through. Detective Jane Miller stood at the edge of the woods, staring at the darkened outline of the convent in the distance. The investigation had been dragging on for months, yet with each new lead, the mystery surrounding Sister Evelyn's disappearance seemed to grow more complex and unsettling. She had heard rumors, of course, whispers among the townspeople about strange occurrences in and around the convent, but she had dismissed them as mere superstition. However, as she dug deeper, more than one unsettling encounter led her to question the nature of what was really going on in that isolated corner of Bellerose. It was during a meeting with a local historian, Thomas Green, that the idea of something far darker began to take shape. Green was an older man, well-versed in the history of Bellerose, its churches, and the convent that had stood for centuries. Over coffee in his cluttered office, surrounded by shelves filled with old books and faded maps, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You don't know the full history of that place," he said, his eyes darting to the window as though expecting someone to overhear. "The convent has always been, well, different. The land it's built on is steeped in strange happenings. Over the years, there have been reports of unexplained disappearances, of people who simply vanish, leaving nothing behind but their possessions. It goes back centuries." Jane's curiosity piqued. She pressed him for more. What did he mean by strange happenings? What could he be implying about the convent's role in these disappearances? Green told her that for generations there had been whispers of occult practices within the convent, hidden beneath the facade of religious devotion. These were not just rumors, he claimed, but accounts from those who had lived in Bellerose for generations. He recounted tales of nuns who had disappeared, strange symbols found carved into the walls of the convent, and cryptic messages that had been left behind. At first, these were just stories, things that could be written off as exaggerations, but as the years passed, more people came forward with similar accounts. The historian speculated that these disappearances were not merely the result of human malice, but part of something darker, an occult ritual disguised as religious devotion. The idea was a chilling one. Could Evelyn's disappearance really be part of this long, twisted history? Jane found it hard to swallow, but Green was adamant. "There are those who believe the convent has been the site of occult rituals for centuries," he said. "Rituals disguised as spiritual awakenings, visions of holiness. But in truth, they were manipulating people, controlling their minds, their actions. And now it seems Evelyn might have become one of their victims." At first, Jane wanted to reject the theory outright. She was a detective, not a believer in the supernatural. But as the pieces of Evelyn's case continued to fit together in increasingly unsettling ways, the theory began to take root in Jane's mind. Strange things had been happening at the convent long before Evelyn's disappearance, and now, with the added layer of this occult theory, the entire investigation seemed to be spiraling into uncharted territory. The more Jane investigated, the more her discomfort grew. Eyewitness accounts from locals started to surface, stories of lights seen in the woods surrounding the convent late at night. The lights weren't the usual flicker of a campfire or the headlights of passing cars. These lights moved, often in ways that didn't make sense, seemingly floating in midair or vanishing into thin air. There were also reports of eerie, unexplainable sounds, low murmurs, whispers, and chants that carried on the wind, drifting through the trees around the convent. The sounds were most often heard by those who lived on the outskirts of town, just beyond the convent's reach. And yet, when they went to investigate, no one could ever find the source. These accounts only deepened Jane's sense of dread. The people who had witnessed these events were credible, trustworthy citizens, not prone to flights of fancy or exaggeration. They weren't the type to spin tall tales, especially when it came to something as unsettling as this. The notion that something supernatural was at play, something that went beyond the bounds of the rational world, was becoming harder to ignore. But what was the connection between these eerie occurrences and Evelyn's disappearance? Had she, like the others before her, been drawn into some kind of ritual? Was she part of a larger plan, one that was centuries old, to manipulate and control the women who passed through the convent? Was Evelyn just another pawn in a much darker game, one that no one outside the convent had ever fully understood? As Jane pressed forward, the investigation became more murky. The more she dug into the convent's history, the more unsettling the details became. The accounts of missing persons, strange phenomena, and cryptic rituals painted a picture of a place far darker than Jane had ever imagined. She began to entertain the possibility that Evelyn's disappearance wasn't just a crime, it was part of something far more sinister, something that had been unfolding for years under the guise of religion. But the more she considered this possibility, the more questions arose. What exactly was the goal of these occult practices, and who, if anyone, was pulling the strings? Jane's mind raced with possibilities, each more chilling than the last. Could Evelyn have become caught in a web of manipulation, her mind twisted by forces she didn't understand? Had she been lured into a ritual that involved her disappearance, a ritual that had been planned long before she arrived at the convent? The idea of spiritual manipulation, even mind control, was terrifying, but it seemed to explain so much of what had been happening. The pieces were aligning in ways Jane had never anticipated, and with each new revelation, the feeling that something far more sinister was at play grew stronger. As Jane stood alone in the darkness of the convent's grounds, her thoughts were filled with a growing sense of urgency. Evelyn's case was no longer just about a missing person. It was a puzzle that reached far deeper into the shadows, one that threatened to unravel the very foundation of what she thought she knew about the world. Jane couldn't deny it any longer. The supernatural theory was gaining traction, and if she wanted to find the truth, she would have to confront it head on. The investigation was on the verge of revealing something that could shatter everything. Detective Jane Miller had been on the case for months, but with each new revelation, it seemed like the truth of what happened to Sister Evelyn grew further out of reach. The investigation had taken her to places she never expected, into the dark heart of the convent's hidden practices, into the supernatural whispers of the town, and even into the depths of her own doubts. But it was a simple letter, a small piece of paper, hidden away in the possession of a family member, that would finally provide the breakthrough Jane so desperately needed. The letter came to Jane's attention when Miriam, Evelyn's mother, reluctantly shared it with her. It had been given to her by a distant relative who had come across it in an old box of family memorabilia mixed in with other keepsakes. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, but the handwriting was unmistakably Evelyn's. Jane held her breath as she read the words, the familiar handwriting now more haunting than ever. At first, the letter seemed to follow the same cryptic lines as the entries in Evelyn's journal. The tone was one of fear and uncertainty, but what struck Jane most was the clarity with which Evelyn described her growing unease with the convent's practices. I don't know how to stay silent anymore, Evelyn had written. There's something wrong here, something I can't put into words. They want more from me. They want to control me, and I am terrified that I am losing myself. Evelyn spoke of the strange dreams she had been having, visions of a shadowy figure, a sense of being watched, of being drawn into something she didn't understand. As Jane read on, the words grew more desperate. Evelyn described the overwhelming sense of being trapped, of being pulled toward something she couldn't escape. I need to leave. I need to get out of here before it's too late, she wrote, her handwriting more jagged and uneven. I can feel their eyes on me. They're waiting for me to make a mistake, to show weakness. But I can't. There's no way out. The final lines of the letter stopped Jane cold. In the margin of the page, in a hand that seemed even more frantic, were the chilling words, "They'll never let me go. I'm becoming something else." The cryptic nature of those final words sent a shiver down Jane's spine. What did Evelyn mean by becoming something else? And who were they? Could Evelyn have been manipulated into playing a part in something far darker than she realized? Or had she become a part of it willingly, lured by promises that had led her down a path she could never return from. The letter didn't provide all the answers, but it gave Jane a clear direction. There was no longer any question that Evelyn's disappearance had been part of something deeper, something rooted in the very foundations of the convent. Evelyn hadn't just vanished. She had been drawn into something horrific, something she could no longer escape. The question now was what exactly that something was and where it would lead. Driven by a sense of urgency, Jane followed the trail Evelyn's letter had set her on. It wasn't long before she uncovered another piece of the puzzle, an old map, one that showed a hidden chapel deep in the woods near the convent. No one had ever mentioned the chapel before, but it was marked clearly on the map, its location just outside the town's boundaries, far from the eyes of the community. As Jane ventured into the woods, the air grew thick with tension. The trees seemed to close in around her, casting long shadows that felt as though they were watching her every move. She had heard whispers of strange occurrences in these woods, lights in the distance, strange sounds in the night, but now she was here, standing on the edge of something unknown. The chapel, when she finally found it, was abandoned, overgrown with ivy and almost swallowed whole by the woods. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, but as Jane stepped inside, she could feel the weight of something that had been left behind. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive, as though the walls were holding their breath. Inside, Jane found disturbing signs of ritualistic practices. Scattered on the floor were old candles burned down to stubs, and symbols carved into the stone walls, symbols that matched those described in Evelyn's journal. There were no overt signs of a ceremony recently held, but the presence of the symbols spoke volumes. This was a place where rituals had been carried out, where something dark had taken root. The chapel wasn't just a religious building, it was a place of control, a place where people had been drawn into something they couldn't escape. Jane's stomach turned as she realized that Evelyn had been here, perhaps more than once, caught in something that was far from divine. The more she pieced together, the clearer it became that Evelyn hadn't been a mere victim. She had become part of something far darker than anyone had realized. The ritualistic symbols, the strange practices, the whispered rumors, all of it pointed to a conspiracy far beyond anything Jane had imagined. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Evelyn had not simply disappeared. She had been consumed by the very thing she had feared. The forces that had held her captive were not just human. They were something older, something far more sinister, masquerading as faith. And Evelyn, in her desperate attempt to escape, had been pulled into a web from which there was no return. Jane's heart raced as she stood in the abandoned chapel, the full weight of the truth settling over her. She had come looking for answers, but what she had found was a dark secret buried deep within the heart of the convent. Evelyn's fate had been sealed long before she had written her final letter. And now it was up to Jane to expose the truth before it could claim anyone else. In the emotional conclusion of the investigation, Detective Jane Miller uncovers the horrifying truth behind Sister Evelyn's disappearance. The convent, long seen as a sanctuary, had been hiding a dark and twisted secret. It was a front for a ritualistic cult masquerading as a religious order. Evelyn had been carefully groomed to play a pivotal role in the cult's practices, which went far beyond her vow of chastity and devotion. The haunting images of Evelyn, always looking away in the manipulated family portrait, were not random. They were part of a calculated psychological strategy designed to break her will and keep her trapped within the cult's control. The most shocking revelation came when Jane discovered that Evelyn had never truly disappeared. She hadn't been lost or dead. She had been living under the control of the cult, a prisoner in plain sight, her identity manipulated through the very images that once symbolized innocence. The cult's leader, a trusted figure within the church, had orchestrated the entire scheme, pulling the strings of Evelyn's life while maintaining his position of power. But in a rare moment of clarity, Evelyn had managed to break free from the psychological chains that bound her. She tried to escape, to expose the horrors she had endured, but in doing so, she paid the ultimate price. The final photograph of her, where she looked directly into the lens for the first time, was her last act of defiance. It revealed the painful truth. Evelyn's story wasn't just about victimhood, it was one of survival and resistance, but the cost was too great. She had fought back against the very people who had controlled her, but in the end, it had cost her everything.